Hello, this is 1A, and we're looking at the colonial Americas. But before we get to colonial America, we do need to understand that there's an indigenous population in the Americas prior to European civilization. Now, the best guess that archaeologists have to understand how these indigenous peoples got to the Americas is the land bridge theory. And you can see up here, there is a land bridge that was created when the glaciers kind of sucked up all the water in between modern day Asian territories and modern day Alaska. Early peoples crossed that land bridge and kind of migrated down into northern, middle, and then southern America. Not a perfect theory. There's other alternatives. Pacific Islanders landing in the coast. Somebody suggested alien ones, but this is the best guess we have. It's the land bridge theory. They tended to be hunters and gatherers. Then eventually they did independently discover agriculture. Farming becomes very important in America millennia before the Europeans arrived in the Americas. Some of the important cultures up until 900 CE, that is the Common Era. You might be used to hearing BC. Historians use Common Era now, and before the Common Era for BC, instead of AD, it's CE. So 900 CE, the Common Era, we had the Mayans in Mesoamerica, and that's this area here. That'd be modern-day Mexico area. The Toltecs, about 300 years after them. And then in South America, down here, we have the Inca and the Chibchas in northern South America. So there are important, big indigenous populations in the Americas. Probably the most famous is the Aztec, which we probably should call them Mexica. They were a powerful military empire prior to European arrival. And they were a very complicated society. They had a complicated farming system. They had complex administrations within, the communications between the regions and between the bureaucracy. They had complex continental-wide trade. They had sophisticated architecture. One of the reasons that the Europeans are able to defeat the Aztec is not because of their mass weaponry, their metal weapons, but because the Aztec were such a powerful empire that the people that they conquered did not like them. Part of the reason is because their complicated religion required human sacrifice to continue the rising and setting of the sun, through this idea of blood transfer. So the people that they had conquered and had been used as these sacrifices joined with the Europeans, particularly Cortez and the conquistadors, when they came in the early 1500s. That alliance system is one of the things that helps lead to the defeat of the Mexica at Tenochtitlan, their capital. That's only part of it, though. Part of it is the weapons, sure. But more important is disease. Cortez tries to conquer Montezuma at Tenochtitlan twice. The first time he's repelled fairly easily. The second time, after smallpox ravaged through the population and the majority of fighting people were unable to fight and resist against the Spanish, that's when they're conquered. By the end of the 1600s, roughly 85% of the indigenous population is gone. So disease ravages through these populations. Now, in North America, which is where we're going to focus on our colonial investigation, there's three distinct and diverse civilization groups: the Adena Hopewell, which is over here on the East Coast, the Mississippi culture, which is in modern-day Mississippi area, and the Anasazi over here in, say, modern-day New Mexico, Arizona area. Now, scholars estimate that there were 240 different societies throughout North America by 1492 and many different language groups within them. It's important to recognize that there's over 10 million indigenous people in North America at the time of Columbus's European discovery. Now, people we will see interacting with the British North Americans, or the Algonquins. They cover the area from New England to the Great Lakes and over into modern-day New Jersey and Virginia. When you think of, say, the Pocahontas story, they're probably an Algonquin cultural group. There's also the Iroquois, which is in western New York. The Iroquois League, which is a series of 5 organizations, are going to be important for the Albany Plan of Union, which Ben Franklin is going to propose during the French and Indian War, which is ultimately rejected. Okay, there are some reasons that the Europeans decided to start exploring around the 1400s. Part of it is population growth. The European continent was having more population than it could hold. People are going to go try to explore. They also have a new trade-based economy, right? So they want to make sure that they are getting raw materials that can be turned into finished products, which then can be used to trade. And this new economic system referred to as mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is a colonial system where the mother country is going to send colonists out into these areas. They will gather the raw materials, send those raw materials back cheaply to the mother country, and then the mother country will sell them back finished products. So it's kind of this closed loop circuit where all of the gold stays within the mother country. It's designed to help them. There's also this idea that of the Renaissance, of humanism, to better understand humanity and explore the world and not focus so much on the afterlife, which had been a medieval idea. And there are a lot of technological innovations like the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, which allow for the exploration to occur. Now, you all know this guy. This is Christopher Columbus. In his earlier years, he was attempting to find a passage to the east by going west. And most of what you know about Christopher Columbus is mythology. He's not the only guy that thought the world was round. He actually was terrible at math. He miscalculated the circumference of the earth by about a factor of 6. He thought it was this big and it's really this big. So in fact, the ancient Greeks had calculated within a few hundred miles the actual circumference of the world. So he got lucky. He convinces Ferdinand and Isabella to give him 3 ships to sail into the west in order to try to go around the globe to get to the east. Nobody else wanted to sponsor this journey because they didn't think that the physical distance was possible, not because they thought the world was flat. Now, he does get to land right about the time he estimated that he would get there, but he doesn't run into the Asian territories. He doesn't run into India. What he runs into is what we'd call today the West Indies, places like La Isabela, Cuba, Puerto Rico, those territories. This leads to a frenzy of European exploration, partially because Ferdinand and Isabella had promised Columbus that he could be the owner and governor of the land that he discovered. So when he comes back with proof that he could get there, they send out other explorers to try to get to that land first. Columbus treated the indigenous population terribly. Some could even consider it genocide. He enslaved the population, intended to enslave the population, committed mass murder, and within a 100-year period of Columbus discovering their island, an indigenous population known as the Taínos were completely eliminated. There was none left. Another reason for exploration was the Protestant Reformation. This is Martin Luther. He's the founder of Lutheranism, also the founder of, you go all the way back, he is the progenitor of the Protestant Reformation, protesting the Catholic Church. One of his followers, his name was John Calvin. Now, I wouldn't call him a follower. He takes Luther's ideas and kind of expands on them. This is going to lead to a counter-reformation where the church tries to reform itself and tries to bring people back in. So there is this time of religious fervor in Europe that's going to lead to people feeling persecuted. And that persecution is going to lead to people wanting to find new places to live. One example of this is in England. England has a Protestant Reformation known as the Anglican move, right? So they become known as Anglicans. Essentially, the king becomes the head of a Catholic church, right? So they separate from the Catholic Church, they form their own Anglican church, and the king is in charge. But because that's a Protestant movement, other Protestant movements also emerge, one of which is referred to as the Puritans. And if you see the word Puritan, if you hear the word Puritan, you should hear that word pure. Now, the Puritans wanted to get all of the Catholic trappings, the gold crosses, what they saw as superstitions, out of the church and have a pure religion. This makes the Puritans feel as if they are being persecuted because the Anglicans did not want them having any power or control. So the Puritans tried to leave and try to find a new place to worship. And this is going to become a problem as well because they don't want to stop being British or Anglican. What they want is to be Puritan within England. So they're going to look for some new alternatives, and eventually they're going to find their way to North America. The Spanish are going to control most of Central and South America, along with the Portuguese. The Spanish are going to send out what are called conquistadors or conquerors, and they're going to take over and they're going to conquer the Aztecs. Hernan Cortez is going to defeat the Aztec Empire, mostly through disease and through alliances with other native tribes. Francisco Pizarro is going to do the same thing in the Incan territories down in South America. Now, that said, this is not because of some genetic superiority of the Europeans. It's because of disease and because of politics. The native tribes, the indigenous populations, did not see the Europeans as gods. They did not see them as technologically superior. There was a little bit of politicking involved. We saw that with the Aztec. And most importantly, diseases ran rampant through the population. 85 to 95% of the population will decline within a 100-year period. The Spanish settlements are going to grow in the New World, and they're going to make a lot of money. They are going to find gold, and that gold is going to flood into Europe. And so much gold is going to flood into Europe that it actually causes inflation and crashes the economic system. But every country wanted to get in on the action. The Spanish are going to settle into the New World, and they're going to need to be able to farm and be able to live there. And what they do is they develop something referred to as the encomienda system. Essentially, the encomienda system gave landholders the rights to anybody that lived on that land, the indigenous populations in particular, and they were enslaved. Later, when it proved that the indigenous populations were not good slaves for the Europeans, they could run away, they could live with other indigenous peoples, they died of diseases. Europeans are going to turn to Africans, and they're going to enslave Africans en masse in Spanish and Portuguese South and Central America. This system is later going to be implemented in North America. There were people that were fighting against it. A Spaniard named Bartolomé de las Casas tries to improve these atrocious conditions, but he's largely ignored. The native populations are going to be decimated through enslavement and disease. Part of this is referred to as Columbian Exchange, and you see the word Columbian. When Columbus came to the New World, he brought, and then the Europeans that came afterwards are going to take old world products, and I use old world from the European point of view. They're going to take those European products that were already known in Europe, and they're going to bring them to the New World. Things like horses and pigs, which were not native to North and South America, are going to be brought and they're going to flourish here. There's going to be plants that are taken from the old world into the new world. There's going to be new world plants that are going to go into the old world. Things like sweet potatoes, yams, tomatoes. These are all American products that are going to be brought back into the new world, to Europe. There are various devices, various substances, but most importantly are diseases, because that's going to wipe out the indigenous population. There's almost no examples of American diseases being brought back to Europe. The only one they can find is syphilis, which is questionable. There are English and French and Dutch that are going to explore. Now, Spanish, the Spanish are going to take most of Central and South America. The Portuguese kind of get this area over here with Brazil, and the territory that's left is not as full of gold. So the English are going to go into North America. The French are going to end up in North America. The Dutch are going to start with New York City. Eventually, that's going to become an English settlement as well. The Europeans get involved, the English get involved pretty late, about a century after the Spanish start settling into the New World. And they're going to get what's kind of the worst of the territories, meaning that there's no gold there. They're going to have to find other ways to make this productive land. The first attempt at the English to settle in the New World was the colony of Roanoke in modern-day Virginia, which failed in 1587, but England's going to come back with the Virginia colonies a couple decades later. Now, a little bit of background for these English colonies. They are English. They believe that they're English. The people that settle in the colonies believe that they're English, who just happen to live in America. They want all of the liberties and expect all of the privileges of the English people, even though they're living in America. Now, where do they get the idea of having English rights? Well, there's a big document called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta lays out that everybody's equal before the law and the king is not superior. Now, technically speaking, this is referring to Parliament, which is a legislature of nobles. Think of Parliament as like the National Congress of England. The king would have to ask permission to raise taxes from Parliament. Then Parliament had some limited free speech. Parliament had the ability to have freedom of religion. And it essentially places nobody above the law. Most importantly, though, is that idea of no taxation without representation. Now, the Magna Carta and later the English Bill of Rights are going to lay out these ideas of what it meant to have rights as Englishmen. The English who were living in America believe that this applies to them as well. There is an established church in England, we already mentioned this, the Anglican Church, and there's people that wanted to get away from the Anglican Church. They're Calvinists, which was part of that Protestant tradition. They're Puritans, meaning they wanted to keep their religion pure, and they were trying to get all of that Anglican stuff out of it. They want to become separatists, right? They don't want to be part of the Anglican Church, so they're non-conforming. They're going to become separatists. They try to leave the church, and they're going to even try to overthrow the crown at one point. There's an English civil war because of this religious conflict, and eventually what happens is that the crown is overthrown. The king is killed by Puritans, and there's this thing called the Commonwealth for about 12 years. Nobody liked the Commonwealth, so when the leader of the Commonwealth dies, his name is Oliver Cromwell, Parliament looks around and says, we should restore the crown. We should restore the monarchy, bring back a king. And they do, but they don't like that king because he starts acting like a Catholic and they are Anglican. So there's this whole religious controversy. And eventually what they do is they throw that Catholic king out and they replace that Catholic king. Yes, they replace the king. They threaten to kill him unless he stepped away. King James II angers Parliament. He flees when he finds out that they're trying to replace him. And his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, are going to be invited to rule as joint monarchs. They're called William and Mary. This is referred to as the Glorious or the Bloodless Revolution in 1688. Now, in order to take the throne, they had to sign the British Bill of Rights. So we have the English Magna Carta and the British Bill of Rights. These are the two things that are going to lead to those rights of Englishmen that the colonists believed that they had, which is right under my head there, rights of Englishmen. The most important is that they believed that Parliament can't levy taxes without the people's consent, no taxation without representation, and they believe that the power is derived from the people through Parliament. So there's some important things that are going on there. Now let's take a look at the colonies. We have three major regions: New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southern. Now, New England and the Mid-Atlantic, we're going to refer to as the North. So if you think of just of these two, this is the North, and down here we have the South, and they're going to be quite different. The Southern colonies are going to be formed as joint stock companies, meaning that they were designed initially to protect investors and minimize risk. So they're there to make money. Note that down. The Chesapeake, which is Virginia, which is the South, is there to make money. Now, they don't have gold. So what they're going to do is develop cash crops. Most importantly, they're going to develop tobacco. They're also going to be fairly independent, especially when compared to the Spanish. The Spanish has monarchs, and the monarchs put in governors, and the governors are there to control the colony. The English is really, they're on their own. They're private investors and religious groups. They tended to run their own colonies until a little bit later on when the king gets frustrated with them. In Virginia, they're dealing with the Powhatans. The indigenous population there where they landed was incredibly powerful. And they're going to have some early times. And they're going to have John Smith come in and try to whip them into shape. Now, the Powhatans, important tribal trading partner with the early Virginians. And there's a whole myth around Pocahontas, who was the, let's call him the chief's daughter. Now, there's the whole love story with John Smith and Pocahontas, and all of that is false. Pocahontas was there to try to help John Smith become introduced to the tribe. She was playing a role, almost like a fraternity hazing. Now, over time, tobacco is going to develop as the chief revenue cash crop of the Virginia colonies. And it's because of tobacco and later because of rice along the coast in Virginia and mostly in South Carolina that slavery is going to be introduced into these southern colonies. The year 1619 is the first year that we have on record where African captives were sold into Jamestown by Dutch merchants. And from there, we're going to see that the southern colonies are going to be bringing enslaved Africans into the colonies pretty regularly. We'll talk about that more in a second. Now, in the North is going to be settled by religious dissenters. They call themselves Puritans. Sometimes you hear them called Pilgrims. The North is very different than the South. They tended to be middle-class families. They tended to have small farms rather than cash crops. They tended to have towns which are based around churches and schools. Because the church is so important, that became the central point of each town. And then people would live around the church, and then they developed schools to help people read the Bible. And if you moved too far away from town, you would start your own new church and a new town would form. They tended to form along rivers and streams because that was the easiest way of transport. Now, in 1620, we have Plymouth created in the North. This is the first of the major northern colonies. It was founded by the Puritans and strangers. Now, on the Mayflower, the people that were coming to the New World on the Mayflower, about half of them were Puritans, about half were strangers. The reason that they signed the Mayflower Compact is because the strangers and the Puritans realized that they had to work together in order to make Plymouth succeed. They didn't intend to go to Plymouth. They're trying to get to Virginia. And when they landed in Plymouth, they realized they needed to work together. This is going to be seen as the first self-government. And really, all it is just a few sentences saying that to the king, we needed to work together, form a government in order to succeed in this new strange territory. It's a very simple agreement, but it's the first attempt at self-government. Now, because Massachusetts Bay, which is where Plymouth is going to become a religious colony, they are going to focus on religious freedom, which is different than religious tolerance. Now, John Winthrop, this guy, is the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he wants to create what he called a city upon a hill. It's a very important idea because a city on a hill, everybody's looking up to it, but it's also highlighted so that God can see down upon it. So they need to remain pure in the city on a hill in order to be an example to the people below them, as well as understanding that if they're not pure, God will see it and smite them. So they exiled dissenters. They got rid of anybody that was not willing to go along with their pure religion. They are not tolerant of others. They want their own freedom. Don't want to give it to others. One example of this is that they kicked out Roger Williams, who disagreed with their stance on forced religion. He's going to go to Rhode Island and found a more tolerant colony, saying that forced religion stinks in the nostrils of God. They also kicked out Anne Hutchinson, who had the audacity to believe that women could speak to God. And they're also going to be particularly distasteful of Quakers because the Quakers believed that everybody was equal and that all religion was divine. So they're going to attack Quakers as well from Pennsylvania, who were more religiously tolerant. Now, settling in the Carolinas, back to the South, South Carolina starts in the Carolinas in 1663, 1719. You have South Carolina and North Carolina split and it becomes a royal colony. It is a slave-based colony. In fact, at one point, there are more enslaved people living in the colonies than there are Europeans. It is a plantation-based, cash crop-based economy. Mostly along the coast, it's rice, but there's also some sugar cane. The people that moved into South Carolina tended to come from the English West Indies, particularly Barbados. Barbados was a sugar-based enslaved camp where enslaved Africans were routinely dying. So when the English moved up into North America, they took that idea of how to treat the enslaved Africans and implanted it in North America. They imported the Barbados slave code and enslaved Africans in South Carolina in order to grow sugarcane and rice. Now, in the middle colonies, again, this is kind of New Englandish. in comparison to New England, which was not tolerant but wanted freedom, the Quakers were very tolerant of other religions. They're also going to be tolerant of Native Americans. They're going to practice what we would today call pluralism, this idea of multiculturalism, or the idea that many religions could exist within the colony. It's an example of toleration because they believed that everybody had the same inner light, regardless of their religion or color of their skin. In fact, the Quakers are going to become some of the first abolitionists trying to get rid of enslaved status in the colonies. Very quickly, the African slave trade from 1500 to 1800 is almost entirely one way. We have Africans from the west coast of Africa being taken to North, Central, and South America. Some of them to the English colonies, a lot of them to the English and the Spanish colonies in Central America, and a large portion going to Portuguese Brazil. The African continent, which is many different peoples, it's a diverse population, diverse states, is drained of its resources by being drained of its people. Africa was and is a continent that is rich in culture and languages and religious diversity. American slavery, especially as practiced in North America, but also throughout all the Americas, is going to be different from other types of slavery. We call it chattel slavery, chattel, chattel slavery, because it's going to be based on race and it's going to become a hereditary status. Yes, there's slavery in Africa. Mostly it was people that were defeated in battle, and it was not a hereditary status. Their children did not become enslaved. In North America, we have an entire system that becomes based on the color of skin, and the children of slaves are going to also be enslaved. That's going to have some very drastic consequences in the future. These are the ships that they were crammed onto and what were referred to as the Middle Passage. This purple area is the Middle Passage. 1 in 10 slave ships was going to face mutiny. 1 in 6 African on board are going to die on the journey. Those that make it across are going to be enslaved. That's why there's 1 in 10 ships would face a mutiny. Many people would rather, many of those on board died rather than get to the New World. Once in the Americas, though, the South is going to be heavily impacted by the cultural heritage of the African population. There is a distinct slave culture. Depending on the different regions of Africa, they're going to bring different cultural understandings to this enslavement. In places like South Carolina, where there was a large population of enslaved people compared to the white population, they're going to have a bigger impact than in, say, northern areas where there might be a handful of enslaved people. For example, the Gullah in South Carolina is going to dominate the culture of South Carolina well into the colonial era. Now in the South, there is religion there, but it's not as important as making money. The religion tended to be Anglican. There is a high amount of inequality in wealth and society. We call this a hierarchy. This means that there's a lot of people that are very wealthy on the top, and we call them the planter elites, but really we should call them the enslavers. So the enslavers at the very top of society are the ones that have huge amounts of enslaved people. Below them, there's going to be people that are well off. They might have a handful of enslaved people under their control, or they might just have some land. And then below them are going to be poor white folks, and below that are the enslaved. And it's very difficult to move up and down on that hierarchical society. And the planter elites control everything in the society, including the politics, the Virginia House of Burgess. They do have staple crops, mostly tobacco in the Chesapeake, Virginia areas, mostly rice, indigo, and sugar in South Carolina and Georgia. Now remember that this is all based on trade, right? That sugar, that rice, and that indigo, that's all going to be sent back to the mother country. The colonies are going to benefit from that. They're going to sell their raw materials. The mother country sells the finished products back to the colonies. And the way that the mother country, Britain, does this is by passing laws that control trade, known as the Navigation Acts. Notice this is not a direct tax on the colonies, because taxes can only be completed through representation, which the colonies don't have in Parliament. I also want you to note that if they're trading rice and indigo and sugar, that is a northern trade. So the North is just as involved in the slave trade as in the South. In New England, religion is very important, right? This is the North. Religion is important. Remember the Puritans, but even after the Puritans, it's going to have a lot of religious fervor. That means there's going to be towns centered around churches, there's schools to read the Bible, because they're going to be more tolerant in places like Rhode Island and Maryland and Pennsylvania. There's going to be more immigrants there, also because there's industry that develops around the fast rivers and deep harbors. More immigrants are going to move there, which has aided on by the schools. Now, very quickly, the Enlightenment is going to take hold around the time of the colonial era. This is a search for truth based on rational inquiry, reason, and scientific research. They are trying to understand humanity more than they're trying to understand religion. And this inquiry, reason, and scientific research is going to take particular hold in America, and it's going to be what we think of when we think of the founding fathers. We have the idea of John Locke and his natural rights theory of life, liberty, and property, that everybody has a right to those. He also comes up with a social contract theory that when a government is created by the consent of the people, right, the consent of the governed, and that if the government stops protecting the people's rights, they can overthrow and replace the government. There's also Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu believed that government should have 3 separate branches, which would have separate powers so that they could check each other. And then, of course, in the United States, in the Americas earlier, is the growth of the idea of capitalism created by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.